Welcome in. My name is Everetta, and this lively pile of bones next to me is my bestie Maury. And today we're summarizing the story during the Desolation's Wake event. Previously, I summarized all 3 parts of the Tide Trilogy, which includes Tide of Shadows, Tide of Corruption, and Tide of Desolation. So if you haven't watched those videos yet, I highly recommend that you do so before watching this one so that you're all caught up. I'll leave a link for each one in the description, as well as links for the fully narrated and written versions of the Desolation's Wake story. And with all of that out of the way, let's get started. The Desolation story begins with letters written by Sheriff Hardin and addressed to the stalwart benefactors, who I assume to mean the entities or organization responsible for providing payment to the bounties collected in the bayou. In his letters, the sheriff describes his encounter meeting the man the benefactors sent to him. The man arrived on a train. He was slender, wore a top hat, and had a look of arrogance and superiority about him. There were also around 40 cases of ammunition and weapons stacked around the man. Not trusting him, the sheriff drew his pistol and pointed it at him, and the man had done the same, pointing his at the sheriff. Sheriff Hardin asked him what his name was, but the man didn't respond. And after a moment of them standing with their guns drawn, but neither pulling the trigger, the man asked, "Which way to the bounties?" But it was then that someone else took their shot. A bullet ricocheted near the man's head. They tracked down the shooter, and the sheriff read her rights, tied her to a tree, and began stepping back 10 paces to execute. But the man from the train shot her from 5 and then said, "I'm a statesman. I know how to treat vermin." The next time we hear from Sheriff Hardin is from an interview transcript, but it doesn't say who the person conducting the interview is. The sheriff talks about showing the statesman where he had an encounter with Rotjaw, which resulted in him now having a limp. The statesman wanted to know every detail about Rotjaw, her lightning, her token, her size. So the two decided to hunt her, giving the statesman a chance to ask all his questions and the sheriff the opportunity to gain some sway over him. Before long, the two run into what the sheriff describes as the stench of vermin. In this instance, I believe vermin is referring to the grunts. And without even needing to discuss it, they break into their supply of weapons and ammunition and begin shooting the grunts. The sheriff says he knew they were supposed to ration the cases, but couldn't resist the temptation of cutting a little loose. This moment must have given them something to bond over, so to speak, because afterwards, they began talking. The sheriff told the statesman he was a better shot than any lawman he'd seen before, aside from himself, and the statesman told Hardin that he'd never met a sheriff who'd stay to protect a town where only the dead remain. He then mentioned that the benefactors had plans for a lawman who could lead a slaughtering force from the front line. After their discussions, it was apparent to the sheriff that the two agreed on how to go about stopping the corruption that plagued the bayou. Later, the sheriff and the statesman took turns testing the statesman's new Mako rifle on some of the members of the Demented Pack that were hanging around Moses' poultry. While they sat 300 yards away, passing the rifle back and forth as they picked off the hunters, the statesman told the sheriff more information about the benefactors. He said they were a council of rich folks playing poker with bounty tokens, dabbling in the occult. The sheriff was happy to finally be getting this kind of information after all the time he had been searching for answers. This lit a fire in his soul and gave him new faith. However, after expressing this in the interview, he then goes on to point out that faith can blind you, though. While the two had their fun shooting at the Demented, they didn't realize someone was sneaking up. Someone in the bush tagged the sheriff with a silenced rifle. He took cover to patch himself up, and when the dust settled, the statesman was gone. Whoever took him only left behind a fish speared on a branch, wearing his top hat. For a moment, the sheriff contemplates if he should just do nothing about the statesman being taken. After all, surely he knew what he had signed up for when he came here. All the sheriff would have to do is write a letter explaining the statesman had perished on the hunt, and there'd be one less person to answer to. But ultimately, he did what he believed he always did, his duty. Sheriff Hardin looked at this situation as an opportunity for the lawful pact to demonstrate their worth and for him to demonstrate his leadership. He goes on to explain that this would involve purging unruly citizens from the earth, and that once every green moon, duty and pleasure do happen to mix. So Hardin began investigating, conducting intense interrogations, determined to find the statesman before the next train pulled in, or else the additional arsenal he commissioned would be forfeit. But we'll come back to the sheriff's story in a bit. Another hunter we hear from during this event is Felis, whose accounts are recorded verbally by an unknown transcriber. Felis talks about how she had tracked Hardin. She wanted his blood. His scent lingered on bushes and the insides of sheds, along with another smell, something that was like fox piss and campfire. It was easy to follow. When Felis had returned from the land of the dead, the lonely howl sought her out. He told her he saw a name written on the moon, and went on to say that the sheriff has risen to the top of the pack. He got to Rotjaw before us, claimed her as his discovery. He sat back and let the packs take on the fires and the wrath of Desolation. He's ready to step into the fight now, and he's strong. Felis replied that they won't be tamed by cowboys, and the lonely howl said, the death pact seems not to mind. As a slug made its way across the stump, Felis poured ash that was gathered from when the first blooms of Desolation appeared onto the slug. Its skin hissed and bubbled. Felis went on to say, there is no law here. Only nature, only hunger. Desolation showed me unexplainable things. I see the world different now. I can feel corruption spreading outside the bayou. The slug continued to crawl on and smoke like it was a train, a hexed premonition. And Felis said, let's see how hungry Hardin is. Let's see how far he'll go to eat. The next time we hear from Felis, her and Lonely Howl are waiting for the hunter known as Centipede. When Centipede arrives, she's dragging a man behind her, his hands bound and his head covered with a potato sack. Felis couldn't help but notice the contrast between the coarse material of the sack and the man's fine clothes. He was a well-dressed devil, or at least thought of himself as such. Felis ripped off the man's hood, and he said, you'll regret this. I'll remember every face in this godforsaken swamp. We'll chase you down like foxhounds and stomp your faces into the mud. Felis replied that he'll forget this chase soon enough and go back to his hunting money. She added, you call yourselves the lawful, but you bark like animals. They're barks of fear, not command. The statesman spat into the dirt, saying, you're Felis. I know you. Mark your days carefully. You only have a few free ones left. Felis pointed out to him that he's not dead yet, but he could be, and then asked him if he wanted to know why. She had Centipede show the statesman her tattoos. They were insane and twisted markings of insects beheading mice, foxes, oxen, and men. She had been a member of the Demented Pact before joining Felis and the Primals. When they first found Centipede, she was the only one left alive after a bloodbath that resulted from the Lawful Pact's order. Felis showed her the wilds, the beauty of the chase, the kill, and showed her that the sculptor was just one in a long chain of hunger, and that one day there would be something bigger than it, too. The statesman asked, so you left me alive to tell me this? What good will it do you? Felis replied, we tell you this because you're not a threat. You're bait. We honor our bait, respect it. Even you. Bait can be a warning and teach lessons to its kin if it survives the bite. But let's put a pause on this real quick, because while the Primal Pact and the Lawful Pact are busy with each other, the Death Pact and the Drown Pact have bigger issues they're trying to make sense of. In letters addressed to Lulu Bassett, Sophia writes about the aftermath following their journey into the land of the dead. At the bottom of King Snake Mine, Wormbite crouched at a mud sculpture. He tells the Death Pact that the graven path is closed. He's made sure of it. But something is still wrong. He was surrounded by mud art, rude mountains, sludge trees and animals, the landscape of a lost mind. The Bone Mason told him, it's time for you to come out. And the Wormbite replied, you don't know what it was like in the land of the dead. It was war. A religion being unmade. Sophia told him to rest and that you walked into Death's dream and woke him up. We've won. A tall nest of clay stood at the center of his works, and as he placed a pocket watch on it, he said, every grave I've dug was wasted. Sophia asks if his mud friends told him that. Wormbite replied, this is the calendar. Just wait. In 1 minute, an altar will emerge right here. As they waited, Sophia had visions of trees taller than she had ever seen, an infected chimney with infected men crawling out from the top, miners sipping molten metal from a cauldron until their jaws burned off. But these visions are interrupted when suddenly the mine shaft they're in began to tremble. Spines emerged from the ground where Wormbite had placed the pocket watch calendar of mud. He huddled at the base of the altar and looked up to it like he had seen it 1,000 times before and said, you can never unsee the mound. Sophia said, fine, and took out her derringer, loaded with penny shot ammo, and fired a round into the altar, telling Wormbite, you can't shoot what you can't see. The Bone Mason pulled Wormbite away as the altar readied to explode. In her next letter, Sophia writes that the Wormbite's memory was bewitched from his time in the land of the dead. Sometimes he thinks he's been shot and screams. Sometimes he thinks he's just been born, unable to remember his name, and thinking the bone mason is his mother. And now he's spread his madness to the rest of them. When Sophia smells one of the spine altars, she sees a forest bent in furies of the wind. Terrible machines growl and gnash the earth. Dead horses decay on high hills, ripped in half by monsters. The Death Pact reached out to their newest members, Brood and Bile, for help. Bile confirms that Wormbite's mind contains echoes of the land of the dead, and they all listen while Wormbite tells them the tales of statue fields, a terrible serpent swallowing a steamboat, and monsters piled so high they scarred the moon. Brood says that a ritual can show them more and help them find out where these altars are coming from. The ritual performed showed the Death Pact a vision. They saw blood pouring from a train, painting a red line across the desert. Hunters fleeing the swamp and following the line towards a range of mountains, leaving only the boss targets to scream in their lairs, corrupted to shiver and walk the woods, and the drowned hunting forever through the rain, fire, sunsets, and blooming ash. When their vision ended, Bile explained that the altars and the drowned were entwined. They dwell in a place as broken and flooded as their souls, Darren's shipyard. The Death Pact made their way to the shipyard, where they found the drowned banishing an assassin. But with them was a new witch hunter. He went by the name Hexbreaker and scribbled notes as the drowned rat muttered. The drowned rat explained to them that it's the drowned's burden to keep the graven path closed. When they breathe, mud churns. When they sleep, their eyes fill with blight. It is their very lives that have sealed off the land of the dead. The Wormbite asks, "Then why have the altars returned? We destroyed the mound." The 13th mate answers, "It's for the same reason flies come out of dead bodies. They spread where they can." The drowned kid then stepped forward and told them that they still hear Lynch singing as she goes about her work. Sophia asked them, "And what work is that?" Hexbreaker explained that Lynch has tossed her personhood aside and that she's a kind of nature they don't understand. And the kid added, "She can only exist where the corruption exists now. We hear her voice far away, traveling." Having heard of Lynch, Hexbreaker had come to the drowned to learn about her ways. He asked Sophia, "Do you know what salvation a witch seeks? What makes them dance naked under a moon or eat the heart out of a living deer? They want to taste a blackness beyond sleep. They want to bathe in the well all curses flow from, and to do that, they cannot stay a witch. They must become a monster." In her letter, Sophia tells Lulu that she believes Hexbreaker and that she's had dreams of the corruption spreading somewhere new. Lynch has joined death to grab their souls, and if they don't stop it, Lulu will lose her. So she's going to look for help. Looking for this help, Sophia and the Death Pact sought out Sheriff Hardin. When they find him, he's in a cabin raised above the water and is interrogating 3 members of the Primal Pact. Below them in the water waited Rotjaw. The bone mason tells the sheriff, "This isn't law, it's ruthless and unusual." Tipping his hat, Sheriff Hardin replied, "Beg your pardon, ma'am. If I wasn't sworn on this badge, these degenerates would have their hands behind their backs holding nothing but toothpicks. They're filthy kidnappers." The sheriff asked his prisoners about Felis and the missing statesman. Each primal member remained silent, and Hardin kicked them one by one into the water with Rotjaw. The Death Pact had tried to reason with Hardin to save them. After all, every pact was needed now, but he couldn't see the bigger threat. Sophia asked him if he knew what made them hunters. He replied, "Sure. Tracking, staying quiet, but you here just don't seem fit to shut up." Wormbite told Hardin, "It's the inoculation, the concoction that runs through all our blood. Gives us dark sight. Do you know who made that shot?" Sheriff Hardin replied, "Sure I do, but if it's all the same, I don't care who made the gun I'm holding. I just mind if it puts a hole where I want." Wormbite continued by explaining that Lynch's blood was strong enough to open the land of the dead, and then asked what he thought Lynch could do to them with all her design flowing in their veins. It was then that the sheriff paused and told them if they want cooperation, answers, and help, then they would need to join him in getting the statesman back. After this interaction is when all of these hunters' stories come together. Felis, accompanied by Lonely Howl, Centipede, Ironbark, and other members of the Primal Pack, take the statesmen to the rail line. They hid behind old cannons to wait for the lawful, and just as Lonely Howl had stated that the lawful were late, gunshots fired from the tree line. A bullet ricocheted and hit Ironbark in the leg. Lonely Howl returned fire. Centipede threw a spear that landed in her target's throat. Felis shot an oil barrel, creating a smoke cloud that gave them cover. The gunfire stopped, and Sheriff Hardin called for Felis to come out. She peeked out and saw the statesman holding Centipede at gunpoint and 3 hunters dead around her. Patting Ironbark on the back, the statesman said, "We bought you animals out. Turns out money talks more than mouse heads and summoning stones." But the standoff was interrupted by the arrival of a train. The hunters watched the train pull in as guns fired from it. Railmen fell off the sides, dead and covered in hive filth. The freight cars were smeared with blood and covered in dust from crossing through the desert. The doors burst open and 2 meatheads tumbled out of the beat-up train car. Phyllis takes in the scene, seeing Ironbark standing next to Hardin. She also spots Wormbite at the tree line and realizes the Death Pact made a deal with the sheriff, too. Hardin calls out to Phyllis again, saying, "There's deeper evils out there. Just look at the train. Our problems here have spread. Let's compromise. I want to die from old age, not poison and monsters." Phyllis replies, "Funny how compromise always involves kissing your ring, Hardin." Waving his pistol in the air, the sheriff says, "We can't have more demented or another fall to the sculptor." Phyllis calls back to him, telling him to look at his hostage, referring to Centipede, and that the only thing that saved her was the freedom to be wild, to follow her instincts. Hardin responds by saying that hunters aren't beyond the law, and Phyllis argues that nature is the law. She then tells him she's taking the train and asks if he will agree not to shoot. Hardin asks if she's calling a truce. Before she can reply, a hunter in his union suit showed up late. As he stumbled from the trees, he shot, maybe even by accident. However, regardless if it was an accident or not, this caused the rest to open fire in response. As the fight broke out again, Phyllis made a run for the train. The lonely howl stoked the engine and pulled her on board. And as the train began to depart, Phyllis shouted out to Hardin, saying, "Let's call it more of a head start." After the shootout at the railway, Sheriff Hardin writes another letter to the benefactors. He explains he's designated the primals as scouts for now, and that he allowed them to take the train since it was infected, and he'd prefer a cleaner ride over to the west. The statesman wasn't able to give an answer as to why the train arrived in the condition it did, but he and the sheriff agreed that at best, it was a call for aid. So Sheriff Hardin decided to take a leave of absence and provide that aid. Hardin adds in his letter that he knows the truce won't last, and when the time comes, he won't need another train supply of firepower. He'll need an army. The final chapter of this story is again addressed to Lulu from Sophia, but in this letter, she explains that she doesn't plan to actually give Lulu this one, but her words mean nothing if not aimed at her, so she has to write them down like this. Sophia writes about Lulu being asleep in the rail car as they pass through the desert. She'll still miss it, but the bayou is the burden of the drowned pack now. They've become the guardians to it. She goes on to talk about death. Looking out the window, she observes that dying in the desert is dry and desperate. That death has no passion here. His kisses are cacti and blisters. The death she made a deal with was different. He was giant, a rotting skeleton who gurgled with the rasping throats of men caught in trees. She doesn't know what death will look like further west, but she's heard rumors. Sunsets paint the canyons and make the rocks bleed. The air is thin, hard to breathe. Things are alive there, in a wildness the swamps forget. She ends her letter by saying, "On the other side of these mountains, dying will take a new shape. Its shadows will be the skeleton of you and me, back to back, and 1,000 gun barrels, waiting to sing." After the last chapter is a post-event epilogue that says, hunters ride uneasily on the rails towards mountains, following an unseen trail of despair. A new hunting ground waits for them, painted red, high and dry, and thirsty for blood. And that concludes the storyline for Desolation's Wake. Another great story building on the lore in this game. This one was a lot more concise, and although all these Battle Pass stories have been 15 chapters, this one felt shorter, but not in a bad way. It's clear that after the Tide Trilogy, Desolation's Wake was written to bridge the story from everything that's happened in the Bayou so far to what's to come in the big engine update and the next event, which we now know to be Scorched Earth, and will take place in Colorado. One of my favorite parts of this story was the callback to the origins of the serum that allowed women to safely join the hunt in the bayou. I've briefly talked about this before in a speculation video I made over a year ago, where I speculated if the Tide of Shadows was the return of Lynch, which, side note, was kind of onto something there. But anyway, Sheriff Hardin absolutely knew who the creator of the serum was because he teamed up with Lynch at one point and she showed him how to perform the ritual to make it. So I thought it was really cool how they tied that into this event. Now that Lynch has returned as a prominent figure in the current lore, I'd love to make a dedicated video going over her origins, as well as Sheriff Hart, because he also has quite the history, so keep an eye out for all of that. And in the meantime, feel free to come hang out with me on Twitch, where I exclusively stream Hunt Showdown. You can find me live every Friday and Sunday at 7 p.m. Pacific. I play a lot of solo versus trios, and sometimes teams, and I always love chatting with people about the game and its lore while I'm playing. So swing by and say hi. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you all in the mountains. Goodbye.